Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Glorianna Davenport. Glorianna is a principal research associate and founding member of the MIT Media Lab, where she leads the Media Fabrics group. Trained as a documentary filmmaker, Glorianna has achieved international recognition in her work in digital media forms. Her recent work explores the emergence of a new paradigm we call the media fabric, a semi-intelligent organism consisting of a vast and evolving collection of media artifacts, structures, and programs that support our engagement in a meaningful way. Situated in and around modern communication networks, the media fabric beckons us into a diverse landscape of creative story potential that is synergistic with our imagination and integral to our everyday life. Glorianna has published many technology journals. She has presented and exhibited her work at many international symposia, conferences, and film festivals, and she has taught many media workshops and has served in an advisory capacity to several nonprofit and commercial organizations. I would also like to mention that our presentation today will be archived to the public for Google Video. So if you have any questions in the Q&A session that are Google internal, please wait till after the presentation. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Glorianna Davenport.
Thank you, Mary, and Eric Schulman, who's my, I guess, stepson, for taking me out to breakfast this morning and introducing me to the Google site. I guess I was last here on this particular campus many years ago when SGI was a very small organization, growing. So I've been around for a little while, I guess, and I'm still sort of focused on the same set of problems that I've been focused on for a long time, which is how can we really have an audiovisual world where we can use those audiovisual elements to communicate and sort of in our everyday life as opposed to only on television networks or even only on the internet in a sort of a non-face-to-face world. So I thought I'd begin with a couple of introductory remarks about the Media Laboratory. Many of you know the Media Laboratory. It was founded in 1985, and we have gone through a couple of directors. We have a new director who just started in January. His name is Frank Moss. He was formerly at Tivoli, and he's sort of bringing us into the next generation of work. The Media Lab started trying to bring together print, film, and computing in the early days. Nicholas Negroponte is well known for his sort of pioneering work trying to get industry to recognize that there was going to be a lot of digital media out there. The next decade of our work was really on digital in everyday life. The lab is very broadly situated. We have 32 principal researchers or faculty, and they all have different specialties. Not one of them has the same background. So today we're everything from augmented exoskeleton work with Hugh Hare's Leg Lab. Hugh believes, eventually we'll be able to attach to ourselves mechanisms that allow us to move through space much faster, jump higher, not use cars as much, to people who work in material sciences, and then a core group of faculty who began when the Media Lab started, who are still really working in the digital media area. And Google is a member of the Digital Life Consortium. So this means that you have access to all of our IP, you have access to any of the individual researchers at the Media Lab. If you care to have, if you find on the website something that interests you and you want to have a one-on-one conversation, or you want to get to something in our archive, you can do that as well. Probably talking to Mary. In the Digital Life Consortium, which is run by Andy Lippman, we have, I just want to mention these 5 directions because they have some implications for my work as well, and hopefully for your work. Viral communications, we're working a lot in the peer-to-peer area, really looking at how people can borrow power from other people, how people can cache on other people's machines, with the idea that we'll make something that works better than any individual mechanism that is out there. We have a lot of work in intelligent machines. Cynthia Brazil is working with robots, sort of everyday robots, who might help you look after your mother, for instance, and trying to make those robots intelligent and have affect when they engage with you. Deb Roy is in cognitive architectures. He's just had a young baby, and the baby is being videoed by something like 22 cameras in his house, plus audio in every room, because he's interested actually in how children learn language, but if you want to see a lot of data, he's working with it, and he has particular ways that he's looking at trying to draw out content and meaning from that vast amount of material. And stay tuned, because that's a 5-year project, and he's going through many terabytes and sort of using SneakerNet to get the terabytes from his house into the lab. We have a lot of people working in learning and expression, and we have for many years. Seymour Papert, those of you who know the lab, Seymour Papert was at the lab. He wrote Logo and has spent the last 20 years probably looking at how children learn. And most recently, he and Nicholas Negroponte have partnered in the $100 laptop, which is the idea that we can bring the cost of the laptop down to $100. That laptop, while some of the research on the design of it is being done in the Media Lab, most of it has spun out to something called 1 computer per child. The idea is to manufacture millions of computers very fast and deploy them in parts of the world where there isn't much density of computer use today, or in places there's a lot of density, but the country itself wants more density. The idea is that the countries will pay for the computers and then deploy them into kids growing up in the educational field. And what I like about this laptop is it's running Linux. It's an open system. It's a peer-to-peer system working in a mesh network. And so kids can collaborate with each other and only occasionally hit the internet. So it's maybe one of those few instances you'll see where there's a huge deployment where the internet is not the primary means of swapping material sort of in the short term. The reasons for that are to bring down the cost of the laptop. We have to have a very, very lean laptop, and it's going to have to get together with other laptops in order to do certain kinds of things. But it's also because a lot of the places we imagine it will be deployed may not have such easy access to the internet, and certainly don't have the wealth to pay for connectivity that costs money. So these laptops were initially with a crank so that you could hand crank them for about 10 minutes. If you cranked them up, you'd have about 10 minutes of runtime. That's gone to some different designs for the energy generation, because the crank makes you not be able to do anything with the laptop while you're cranking, obviously. And my Media Fabrics group, I think a lot about the media is all out there, and how can we bring pieces of media together into a story form that is interesting and meaningful. I meant to mention in the learning and expression piece, another big piece, and the piece I'll mostly talk about is the Common Sense Initiative in the lab, which is to grow a huge database of common sense, to use that common sense then to parse through content and be able to synthesize content from what the computer understands. So again, Frank Moss really sees the next 10 years as being scalable human-machine partnerships, and I think that that's a pretty good term to talk about almost all the work in the Media Lab today. So what do I want to do? It's always hard to explain because media, you know, it sort of is very fluid. Different people think media does different things. There are big companies, there are small companies, and there's your home camcorder. But just in short, I sent my grandson a while ago a little card that I made. It took me hours to make the card. I had to cut and paste images, go into Photoshop, do this or that. What about if you could just tell the computer a story and have the computer then send you a bunch of images that you could put together into a sort of animation that was funny and it was a kid's story? Would you invent kid stories? Would your kids enjoy making stories that way? There's a lot of overhead, even once you have the idea of telling a particular story, of finding the images, putting the masking on, changing the color, and we could do it better. Similar thing is, I would like to recall and share my experiences in China using images from my own collection. I put about 2,000 still images on my laptop a year personally, and I shoot 200 hours of video. And since I'm trained as a filmmaker, I'm pretty focused on the type of collection I'm making. Current commercial venues don't really support the type of story that I think about which are sort of coherent stories about particular topics where you might have 100 sequences on one particular general theme. And I'd like to be able to navigate through those in a storied way, come back to them over and over again, get different perspectives. And then what if I could learn from other people's perspectives? Institutional archives today, I don't know what Google's looks like, but they suck. They're in general, you're locked into a 1-hour format. You don't know what's in that format. You can't jump around. You can't extract a nice little 5-minute section of my talk that might go very nicely with a 5-minute section of somebody else's talk, so that when you want to put together a background piece on what's happening in video today, you actually can do that using video, as opposed to looking at the video and making some text notes. I put together a few images from my own collection and present them like this. So if I would tell a story in time like that, it's a very small example, but I could say I have nieces and nephews who grew up on the beach. They had a dog they loved, who very often slept in a chair near them. Sometimes the kids wanted to look like grown-ups. At other times, a more grown-up kid would be watching younger kids on the beach. All of these images have a lot of memory for me. They really tell the story of my family, but they don't tell the story if I have to look at them singly. A single picture does not tell that kind of story. And for me to go through the number of pictures I have is, again, a lot of overhead. So can we create storied navigation for media collections? I know Google is working very hard on the video aspect, and yes, we can, but what does it take? And there are many different methods out there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the theoretical framework that I use, which is able to be told in a few sentences. And then we can talk a little bit about how storiedness might change what we do with media, and what are technologies that at least I'm applying to the problem, and a few things that are in the immediate future of my work. And I'm happy to have discussion during the time I'm talking or afterward, but if there's a time you think I'm racing over something, you want a little more detail, just give me a buzz. So there are some assumptions I make. One is that media archives will continue to grow. I'm not going to defend that in any way, and that the consumption of media will continue to be driven by the consumer's convenience, by the meaningful engagement with the media, which includes construction, as well as searching and having a story told for you, and reasonable cost. Again, I don't plan to discuss any of those, I just assume them. And I'm also assuming demand for mobile access will grow, which means that I think it makes a very good argument for the type of collection-based storytelling that I talk about and that's beginning to happen in the industry, but without any real information layer helping you make it more storied. So there are two problems that I think relate to storiedness that are useful when you think about building a UI or building an architecture. One is the problem of intention. We all collect media based on our individual intentions, but sometimes there are many intentions and there are conflicting intentions. So if we take 20 photographs on a trip, we may take them for different reasons. And that needs to be reflected. Some people call it metadata. I don't like the term metadata because I think it's sort of come to mean some things that it shouldn't, that are very limiting. But you want to sort of understand what the intention was in taking the image, and then you need to understand what the intention is of the people receiving the media. And that intention needs to be adjusted as you sequence media, because as you sequence media, you add new meaning. So how can we capture knowledge about intention and use it? And the second theoretical piece is the problem of the extraordinary and the ordinary. All stories that we know of for millennia have been about ordinary life. And what they do is they take little bits of ordinary life and they elevate them for the purpose of the story to an extraordinary status. The extreme example of that is hero stories, where you get somebody who's really a normal person, but they happen to be in a situation that is told in a way where it makes that situation extraordinary. But even if you have a 2.5-year-old child who tells you something, is before a child really uses because in their sentences, they understand things that change the normal course of their everyday life. Something that happened, they fell and hurt themselves, they came home. They know if they hadn't fallen and hurt themselves, they might have been going along and doing something else. So we use this notion of the extraordinary event in our everyday language, and it's part of how we understand the world. So everybody records video all the time. I don't like to say anything bad about the Media Lab at all, but this is what our video website looks like. And you can go down it for a very long time. It's a list. It tells you who spoke. Everything is about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. Very few people have time to go into it. And actually, Eric and I were just talking about this. How many of you go into the archive and look at something after the fact? Because maybe you don't have time. Maybe you should be doing that instead of listening to me, but you're here, so that's good for me. Because you are Google, you know what Google does online. I'm sure you also know what Flickr does online, but just I thought I would put a little Flickr up just as an example. So I can look at beach, and I can get a lot of beach pictures. People have tagged, very nice. I can look at what tags people have made and how popular they are. And I can go to these tags and I can get some more pictures of beach. But the pictures don't, unless I'm part of that social engagement who wants to tag and see my pictures come up, they don't really help me. There's nothing here that's going to make me want to go into those pictures or is going to show me what might be coherent with some other picture I have. So for instance, if I have a picture of a beach and I have my grandkids building a castle, and I remember there was some guy flying a kite down the beach, but I didn't capture the guy flying the kite. So I have to make a very specific query of person, kite, whatever, in order to come to a picture that doesn't even know whether it matches the pictures that I have and would look good next to it. So that's sort of where we are today, except YouTube and Google. It's great that people can post their videos. I think that that's great. There's a lot of repurposed content on this. That's not really the content I'm the most interested in, actually. So here's something I did a while ago. Seymour Papert had a workshop in 2003, and we'd done a lot of media blogs at that point. We just put media into the blog, and you'd post the blog, and people would comment on it. And by the way, I think it's very curious that it took almost 10 years to have a calendar state come up as a sort of a storage archiving interface for media, but that's part of the web. But in this piece, we documented in detail Seymour and Jacques d'Amboise, and I'll show you a little video, although that was a really bad idea.
It happened by accident the first day. We didn't see it. But someone went behind the screen, and
So
we
that's
saw silhouette,
Jacques
which
d'Amboise.
was wonderful.
Actually, several were playing
They were
with
doing it
shadows.
just
and seeing as
We're going to do
they
that,
could.
but that's on Saturday. We'll
On
play.
Saturday, we'll play with those things we do.
But this basically is, if we can get the music, the lighting, and these things with the dancers activated, that's going to take so much time.
Okay, I'm going to just pause that, and I apologize for that. I didn't realize that. I had to click in it. But there are about 250, 300 of these sequences that document the 12-day workshop in great detail. The idea was that the kids would wear sensors on their body, and as they danced, they'd be able to control lighting and music that they had made, and graphics. And by the end of this, they got to make their own dance. And there's a lot of discussion about whether Jacques was too much of a top-down teacher or whatever. But the interesting thing is, how could you go into that collection and just get 5 clips that tell you what a day in that workshop was like, or the progress that were made, or what were the key issues? So I'm going to talk about 3 approaches that we have right now that I'm working on in media. One is common sense reasoning, which applies to this particular problem. Then I'll talk a little bit about some audio time-lapse work, and finally I'll talk about a rich media construction kit. And so in about 2001, Kush Singh, who was for a very short time faculty at our lab, developed something called Open Mind. And Open Mind, the idea was that everybody in the world could use the web to put in common sense, because otherwise, how are we going to get all of this all these things that everybody knows, but the computer doesn't know? So at the same time, my student Barbara Berry was thinking about, well, what if you're a documentary filmmaker in the world? Could we use this common sense back the other way and give you a suggestion about what to shoot? And what's nice about the work that she did, if you think about it, because I'm going to talk about it from the camera aspect a little bit, but it flips back the other way. So once you've used the camera and annotated from the camera stuff, anything that the camera learns about what you were shooting is already, you can call it metadata or anything you want, but it's attached to the video, and it can then be used by a system. So the camera looked like this. It was a Sony camera with a computer. And when you'd taken a shot, you annotated the shot as briefly as you wanted to. And the system used 2 resources. One was OpenMind ConceptNet, which is a set of concepts. So you can look at this and you wake up, and where do you wake up? You wake up in bed. What was the last sub-event to get out of bed? What happens afterward? You drink some coffee. Stuff like that. It's just everyday life that has been collected from these millions of people on the web, and then put into then parsed, then cleaned, parsed, manipulated, and put into a semantic net. And in addition, there was a resource called LifeNet, which was, this is an activity you did on LifeNet, which was you could add to a list of things that you associated with something. It was sort of like a game. You could put true or false by different assertions, and you could put suggestions. And the idea was to come up with short scripts like, I awake, I feel hungry. So ways that we could think about how people act in the world. She went out and filmed some marathons and used the camera. And so the camera was then suggesting to her, given what she said was happening, what were other things that might happen that would move her story along? If she saw runners who were exhausted, the system might tell you that runners get hypothermia, they need to be warmed at the end of their run, runners celebrate at the end of the run, and so on. It turned out we had a lot of information in the network on marathons. So it was a very clunky first step. And one of the things we discovered was that the concept net was really too low level to use well. So she's gone on to build something called StoryNet, which is just going into its second phase, to have people actually build little stories on the web that are little sequences. And as we get many sequences, we can use them to think about what is this story that you're describing over here like. We also made a comic kit. This was kind of fun. People, what we hoped was people would make these comics, and the common sense system would propose to them different things in the world that they might manipulate given the story that they were telling. So in this case, you have a happy person who has found a seed, and then the system goes and says, well, what are you likely to do with a seed? And one thing you might be likely to do is pick it up before you plant it. And it's a type of system that suggests things within the common sense, and as you grow out the story that you're telling, common sense learns from you. So it's a two-way story. When Barbara looked at the row ballet situation, she also just theoretically parsed how it might work if we had a strong StoryNet to bring out multiple clips. And today I'm working with a student, Edward Chen, and his idea is that you put a story in and you get a story out. Now, I'm not sure that this is a good way to go because you don't know what's in the collection. If you know a little bit what's in the collection or have some expectation, it might be a reasonable way to go in the UI. In this case, we type in Jacques makes a dance, and we get back. Now, each of these clips that we put into the blog that I didn't say before, we described with a very short amount of text. So the system is using that short amount of text that we put in, and it's very little. Consumers do not like to annotate stuff unless it's sort of in a game form. But if it's your own media content, you're digitizing it, you're probably willing to just put in a little bit of material. We have some other work that we're doing in the common sense area that assumes that we can pull from your emails and your calendar and other ways of getting that. But I think you might not mind putting a little piece of text in. So in this case, once you've started, in the first case, Jacques makes a dance, the system goes in and sees what might it find about making a dance. And in fact, it doesn't know anything about the main character, so it gives you lots of examples of different people who are making dance. You can go on and select one of those and then make a new line. And so you're sort of building a story with the system. This is promising. It's not yet ready for prime time. There are a lot of issues, like I said, how do you know what story to make? But it's a start. Okay, we'll switch gears a little bit. Another project I'm working on has to do with the idea that there's a lot of work that assumes if we take data like of this room, So there's a lot of things that happen in this room, and somehow you could make a story out of it. How do we do that? If you really have everything that happens in this room for 24 hours. This is sort of like the Deb Roy problem, although Deb Roy is trying to look at how a child learns language. My student is looking at how do you design objects that have this capability just because you can. So a lot of people get down and they say, well, why do you want an object that's recording audio and making a history of itself? Well, she derives from things like the way we value art and say, if there are transactions that happen, they might not just be ownership transactions. They might be that this bench has witnessed a lot of fun times, so I would like to sit on this bench, or I would like to have this bench. Right now, she is working on a bench. It's about the 4th project she's done. She assumes lots of things happen on the bench. She instruments the bench with microphones, capacitive sensors, and speakers. And then the problem is, how do we, when you sit down and you're quiet for a while, if the bench wants to talk to you, what should it say? So basically, we are looking at a system that allows event detection, matches the event with an event signature and a classification, and can then create what we're calling an audio time lapse, which is quite different from a visual time lapse. So I'll just play these in sequence so you can get a little flavor of this. It's sort of a weird project, very Media Lab-ish.
Okay.
So this is the original audio stream.
Yeah, that sounds so. But I'm gonna wear my gloves. It's not that bad. I don't know. Compared to yesterday was nasty. But have you, going back to the 3.
So that's sort of real time.
Sorry. Have you ever seen the Disney cartoon? You notice a lot of the. There you go.
So this is the machine just taking
Like
from millisecond
I went but just
a certain amount of time. This is just compressing the whole thing at a sort of standard rate. And this is using her current system. I don't know if you can hear it well enough.
I wonder if it's maybe something on the. No, not before you notice it said something. Okay. There it is. In my particular case, I went in the BIOS. You get it as an undergrad. You get a free XP. Oh, that's nice. Free. Yeah. Oh.
So you don't really get any climax in this approach, but what you get is things that the system thinks are extraordinary events, and they're mixed in with sort of ordinary ambience. And I think it's an approach that for long-time collections of lots of data is an interesting approach. And she's defending her thesis probably in 3 months' time, so hopefully it will get a lot better by then. But it's sort of a typical odd Media Lab project to think of designing objects that have this kind of history. The audio time-lapse piece has implications for any kind of video recording where you want to go into the audio track and actually cut from the audio track. The last piece I wanted to show you is sort of what we're doing in media construction kits. So this is called Confectionery. It's a drag and drop interface on the web that allows you to upload movies, images, audio, and create graphics and text, and put those together, and the system creates a flash file for you. And the publication environment allows each piece of media you put up to be tagged with what is called the Creative Commons. We're using the Creative Commons license. So you can say who can use it, you can say where it came from, who can use it, And behind each piece of media, you'll be able to look for that. So that starts to get at this problem that everybody wants to protect their media. It doesn't quite get at the problem because NBC or Warner Brothers are still not going to love you if you clip some of their sound file of some voice and put it over some other type of content. The other thing this web environment does is it allows people to mentor other people in telling a story. And so you can have a very private place to build your story before you let it out into the general world. And so some people will have access to the staged version of the story as it goes along. And hopefully this will play a little bit better. Let me just get rid of some of this. Sorry. Okay. So I'm going to show you.
Project Save has an internship program for high school and college students who love history and photography. And our students are best qualified who have neat handwriting, are detail-oriented, and who also love learning by looking at old photos. And we do train students in archival methods that can be applied to other areas of study as well.
Okay. I'm going to show you one of my favorites is somebody telling the story of her mother and father.
Je me rappelle la fois de Reagan.
Johnny!
So in that piece, we're trying to break up the frame.
This is my brother, me, my father, my mother. This photo is taken in Armenia in 1993. This is a good picture. I love it.
So I love that video because that was made by a 9-year-old boy who had been in the U.S. for 4 days and wound up at a workshop at MIT where he didn't really, I mean, he speaks okay English, but he really couldn't understand everything. So he just watched as his older brother learned to edit, and he learned to edit, and he made something. And all of these kids were really missing their homeland. This was an 11-year-old girl who had just come also from Armenia. So this environment is shortly going to be live, I think within about a month, for anyone to use. And then in particular, we're going to use it within the Armenian community to look at whether we could build a people's history, whether there'd be enough interest of people to put in their life stories, and for other people to build pathways on top of that. So rather than have a historian, which is the typical way histories are written, is you have a single person, they look at events, they tell you how it was, to have everybody contributing to how they see something, and then use an ability of other people to make pathways through that content and say, this is how I see this collection. Which, if it works, and you know, you never know, will be, I think, pretty exciting. So, so I wanted to just mention a couple of things in what's next. I just mentioned the confectionery is going to go live fairly shortly. We have StoryNet 2 coming, is being designed. The architecture for it is being designed now, and we're going to be focusing on how to collect knowledge about intention and goals, and also sequence examples. And then finally, the $100 laptop has a particular issue, and the $100 laptop, I put them up like this. I see I made a little mistake in the Photoshop this morning, but rather than thinking of them as one machine, it's much more interesting if you can kind of conceive them as sort of connected hubs of machines, where people in a particular neighborhood or region are thinking and sharing things together, trying to solve problems. One of the issues that it's raised is if we deploy many, many of these, how do we help people not get stuck? Or actually help them break out of some idea that they how do we get them to a new idea for something? And to give you an example of that, David Cavallo, when he was working I guess it was when he was working in Thailand, he was doing a workshop with some kids, and there was a girl who had to go home every night. She had to go to her parents' home. She had to turn the lights on for a particular agricultural situation in order to increase the amount of daylight hours. And then she would have 3 hours where she could do anything else, and then she'd have to go back and turn off the light in order to save electricity. She figured out that using a small cricket, she could do that remotely. I mean, it seems probably to us fairly obvious, but it's not necessarily obvious. And kids a lot of times solve this kind of problem for themselves and their family if they're given the right tools. But how do you think about that? And how do you think about mentoring that kind of innovative use of the laptop? So we're collecting a large collection of materials that we've developed over workshops, different times, and then that architecture is going to allow anybody in any of the hubs to put in their own information, because one of the things we've learned is that kids, if they can document as they go along, can tell a pretty good story, but they need something that allows them to do that documentation. And the hope is that some of the really good stories will bubble up and then become the things that other people look at. So, I mean, that's a pretty familiar scenario today, but this is just a particular problem area that we're looking at that content. So that's sort of what I have to tell you today, and any questions, I'm happy to discuss stuff. Yeah?
How do you feel the Media Lab is doing today? It seems to me like back in the early 90s, it was just very exciting and sort of on the cutting edge. And then it sort of went through a lull sort of at the end of the 90s in there. And now you have a new director. I mean, what's your outlook? Are you feeling good about it?
Yeah, I am. Oh, okay. Repeat the question. The question is about the Media Lab. The suggestion was that it was a very exciting place to be in the late 80s, early 90s, and then it went into a sort of a lull period, a difficult period for it. And the question is, how is it doing today? I think I tried to characterize this idea of the human-machine partnership, which is an idea that isn't exclusive to the Media Lab. I mean, we're not exclusive in the space anymore, and I think that that is well recognized, but I think that we have incredible synergy and overlap between people who have very different long-term visions for how these technologies are going to affect us. And I think that those larger scale works are growing fast in the lab, which is a little bit different. It's still a lot of little examples, but there's also these larger sort of initiatives. And so I feel very good about it. You know, it's sort of, I'm sort of at a point where I won't be there full time for that much longer, but I think there's starting to be a very good synergy and discussion, and we're starting to get a lot more undergrads again, which was one of the things that happened in the lull. There stopped being as many undergrads engaged in the lab. And I think Frank's doing a great job in getting us to talk to each other. So it's hard. I think it's a stay tuned situation, and certainly being at this institute or this company right now is a fabulous place to be. I mean, it's a very, very exciting time in a company that's really changing how people are using media and what it means to put this next generation of media together. I was telling Eric actually that I do a little bit of work in New Orleans. I've been connected with New Orleans for a long time. And what I'm doing now is trying to have kids design the urban environment or be part of that design process, because otherwise they're even totally out of the political process. It's pretty much of a disaster down there right now, just simple story. And you know, we're working with an architecture firm that uses SketchUp. So I knew that Google had purchased SketchUp, and all of a sudden I see SketchUp with Google Earth. Wow, that's really a fun, new, different way to think about building media environments with pretty easy to use tools. So those aren't going to be the type of projects you're going to see come out of the lab today. I think the common sense effort in the lab, if we can really pull that together, and it's something that I'd like to talk more to Google about, because I think it's really a very promising way to look at meaningful story building. What's your name? Bob Lowe. Okay, it's from Google News, and he's saying there are lots of people building news stories, and then there are people responsible for trying to get those stories into a common framework, and wouldn't it be really great if there was a common framework, and how might you go forward? And I think that that's a type of problem that the lab, that getting a dialogue going with the lab becomes really interesting, because you know, I think that I personally think if you can really harness the common sense work even up to the point that we have it, you have a lot of bandwidth in how you look at evolving news. Okay, that's one thing. The second issue of formatting is complicated one, because the question is, how much do you want a top-down approach? I was talking to somebody at NBC yesterday, and I was at CNN when the head office of CNN was 5 people. And CNN leveraged a totally new organization for making news because there were only 5 people and no union contracts. Everybody was a stringer, and 4 of my students at that time were stringers for CNN, which meant you went out, you made a story you thought was interesting, you sent it in, and it ran or it didn't run. And they got pretty good at being able to have some dialogue with the stringers to find out what was being made, so they could sort of predict when a story was coming in, if it was a story that they really wanted. And of course, eventually, everything was formatted, and their archive that was a mess in the beginning, just an absolute wreck, became very structured because they found that the archive had value. And, so it goes, you know, but that may be an equilibrium that doesn't happen the first day out of the box, because there are different formats out there, but I think that that's maybe even solvable. But I would hate to see it look like, you know, what CNN became finally was a very formatted, regimented news, like every other news, and you almost never in any of these news shows really see what happens. I come out of a documentary tradition that says, you know, situate the camera or situate the storyteller someplace where they can evolve and make a story about what is really happening. And that's hard to do when you get too top down. So I'd love to talk more about that. It's a fascinating problem. Any other? Okay, great.